My parents decided they would sell my country house to buy my pregnant sister an apartment. Mom said she deserved her own space, and everyone acted like I had no say. I stayed quiet and sold the house first. 2 weeks later, they realized their plan had already collapsed. The email hit my phone at 6:14 a.m. Subject line, wire confirmation, sale complete. I sat on the edge of my bed and read it twice before I let myself smile. Then I got up, made coffee, and went to work like it was any other Tuesday. It wasn't. Somewhere 40 minutes north of me, my mother was about to find out that the house she'd been planning to sell out from under me had already been sold by me 2 weeks earlier. She just didn't know it yet. I need to back up because none of this makes sense unless you understand the house. My grandfather built it himself in 1974 on 4 acres outside a town so small it doesn't have a stoplight, just a blinking yellow one at the only real intersection. Cedar siding he milled from his own land. A wraparound porch he added the year my mother was born. When he died, my grandmother stayed there another 11 years, growing tomatoes the size of softballs and refusing every single time my parents suggested she downsize. When she passed, she left it to me, not to my mother. Not split between me and my sister Dana. To me, specifically, by name, in a will her attorney had drafted and reconfirmed with her twice, once 5 years before she died, and once 18 months before, when she'd had a small stroke and wanted to make absolutely sure her wishes were airtight, her word. I remember her saying it at her kitchen table, tapping the folder with one finger. Airtight, Emily, so nobody gets any ideas. She knew her son. My mother's baby brother had spent a decade helping himself to things that weren't his. A truck, a boat, a chunk of her retirement account he'd since paid back a third of. Grandma Ruth had watched entitlement eat through one child already. She wasn't going to let it happen twice. I was 31 when she died. I'd been staying at the house on weekends for 2 years by then, driving up every Friday after work to check on her, later just to sit with her. I painted the guest room. I fixed the porch railing my grandfather never quite finished. I loved that house the specific, unglamorous way you love something you've actually maintained. I knew which floorboard in the hallway creaked, which window stuck in July humidity, how long it took the old boiler to groan awake in October. My sister Dana visited twice a year, Christmas and sometimes Easter if it didn't conflict with anything better. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because it matters for what comes next. The will went through probate cleanly. The deed was recorded in my name at the county clerk's office 14 months ago. I have the recorded copy in a fireproof box in my closet because some habits you learn early. I paid the property taxes myself every March. I had a local contractor, a guy named Pete, who'd known my grandfather, come out twice a year to check the roof and the well pump. I was, by every legal and practical measure, the owner of that house. My mother had never once, in 14 months, mentioned selling it. Then Dana got pregnant. I want to be clear that I was happy for her. I drove up for the gender reveal, a boy, and I bought the ridiculous overpriced stroller off her registry because that's what you do for your sister. What I did not expect was the phone call I got on a Sunday afternoon in March, my mother's voice bright and rushed in a way I recognized immediately as her, I've already decided this voice. Emily, honey, we've been talking, and we think it makes the most sense for the house to go to Dana. She and Marcus need space for the baby, and that house is just sitting there. I put down the dish towel I was holding. The house is mine, Mom. I know, sweetie, but you're not even living in it. It doesn't make sense for it to sit empty when Dana's about to have a baby and they're in that tiny apartment. It's not sitting empty. I go up there constantly, and it's mine. Grandma left it to me specifically. She wasn't thinking clearly by the end, Emily. You know that stroke affected her. That was new. That was a new lie, manufactured on the spot, and I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold, the way water goes right before it freezes. The stroke was 18 months before she died, Mom. She was fine. She re-signed everything after, with her attorney present, specifically because she wanted it to be unambiguous. A pause. Then, quieter, more dangerous. We'll talk about this at dinner Sunday, as a family. I should have known as a family meant with everyone already agreeing against me. I drove to my parents' house that Sunday with a knot in my stomach that never fully loosened, the kind of low-grade dread you carry into a meeting you already know is rigged. Dana was there, 6 months along, her hand resting on her belly in a way that had started to feel less like a natural gesture and more like a performance cue. My father sat at the head of the table saying almost nothing, which was its own kind of message. He wasn't going to defend me, but he wasn't going to actively attack me either. He was going to let my mother do it and stay clean. We just think, my mother said, passing the potatoes like this was a normal Sunday, that it's the fair thing to do. You have your condo, you have a good job, Dana has a baby coming, and a landlord who won't fix the heat. I'm sorry about the heat, I said. That's a real problem. It's not solved by taking a house that belongs to me. Nobody's taking anything, Dana said, and there was an edge in her voice now, the first crack in the sweetness. God, Emily, you're acting like we're criminals. It's a family house. It's not a family house. It's my house. There's a difference, and Grandma made that difference on purpose. My mother's fork clinked down harder than it needed to. Grandma is gone, Emily. You don't get to keep hiding behind a piece of paper she signed when she was old and scared and you were the only one visiting. There it was, the reframe. I wasn't the granddaughter who'd shown up every weekend for 2 years. I was the manipulator who'd cornered a vulnerable old woman into signing something. I felt my hands go cold under the table, that specific ice water feeling that starts in your fingertips and climbs. I didn't say anything else. I finished my my dinner, thanked my mother, and drove home in silence, gripping the wheel at 10 and 2 like it was the only solid thing left in the world. I told myself it was just talk. Frustration. People say things at family dinners they don't act on. I was wrong, and some part of me already knew it. Pete called me on a Wednesday 10 days after that dinner. Pete had been checking on that house twice a year since before I owned it, since my grandfather was alive, and his voice on the phone had a careful, apologetic quality that told me something was wrong before he said a word. Emily, I don't want to step in family business, he said, but a realtor came by the house yesterday, walked the property with your mother, took pictures of the porch, the well house, the garden beds. My stomach dropped straight through the floor. A realtor, younger guy, had a sign in his trunk, one of those coming soon placards. I only know because I was up checking the gutters and your mother introduced him like I was supposed to know what was going on. Did you get his name? Trent Ashford. Ashford Realty Group, out of the county seat. I wrote down his plate number too, if that helps. Emily, I've known your grandfather since 1988. I've been checking that roof for you since before you technically owned it. I wasn't about to pretend I didn't see what I saw. What did he say? The realtor. Did he say anything about the sale itself? Not much. Asked me if the well pump was original. Asked about the acreage line on the east side, whether it extended past the tree row. Talked to your mother like the whole thing was already decided, like he was just gathering details for paperwork, not asking permission for anything. That detail stuck with me longest. Not the photos, not the plate number, the tone. A stranger walking my grandmother's land discussing boundary lines like a formality because someone had told him there was nothing left to formalize. Thank you for calling me, Pete. Course. You take care of yourself, Emily. This is an ugly business, family and property. I've seen it wreck people who had every right on their side and lost anyway, just from being too polite too long. It helped more than Pete could have known, both the plate number and the warning underneath it. I thanked him, hung up, and sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot for 11 minutes before I could make myself drive home. My hands wouldn't stop shaking on the wheel. Not from fear, from the specific, disorienting fury of watching a lie become a plan. I told myself it was probably just my mother getting information. Curiosity, nothing binding. I called the county clerk's office the next morning to check the deed status just to be sure, even though I knew, nothing could be listed or sold without my signature. The clerk confirmed it in under 2 minutes. My name, sole owner, recorded, untouched. Has someone tried to file something against it? I asked. No filings on this parcel besides the original transfer, ma'am. You're all clear. Clear on paper. Not clear in practice, because paper doesn't stop a realtor from walking your property and photographing your grandmother's tomato beds like they're already gone. I found it myself 4 days later at 11:40 p.m., unable to sleep, scrolling a real estate site out of a compulsion I couldn't quite name, and there it was. Charming 3BR farmhouse. Motivated seller. Coming soon. My grandmother's porch. My grandmother's garden. The tomato beds I'd weeded myself 2 weekends ago. Photos taken from angles I recognized because I'd stood in those exact spots. The listing agent, Trent Ashford. No price yet. No MLS number yet. Just a placeholder. The real estate equivalent of a loaded threat with the safety still on. Nothing fired, but the intent unmistakable. I read the description 3 times. The way you press on a bruise to confirm it's really there. Charming 3BR farmhouse on 4 private acres. Original character throughout. Seller motivated to close quickly. Won't last. Seller motivated. As if my mother had any standing to be motivated about anything on that parcel. I took 11 screenshots. Time-stamped, full page, URL visible in every one. The little browser clock in the corner of each image so there could never be a question later about when I'd seen it. I emailed them to myself and to a personal cloud folder, then, almost as an afterthought, printed 2 physical copies and put them in the same fireproof box as the deed, because I'd learned by then, from watching my uncle bleed my grandmother dry for a decade with nothing but verbal promises and no paper trail on either side, that the people who win these situations are the people who documented first and reacted second. Paper doesn't change its story under pressure. People do. I zoomed in on one photo longer than the others. The tomato beds, empty in early spring, just turned soil, and the wooden stakes I'd driven in myself the previous September. Someone had photographed dirt I'd personally touched and put a real estate agent's logo across the corner of it like a brand on livestock. I didn't call my mother that night. I didn't trust my voice yet. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and made a list instead. The way I make lists at work when a project starts falling apart. Every fact, every date, every piece of evidence, laid out cold and sequential until the panic had somewhere to go besides my chest. Text messages, going back 3 months. The dinner conversation, reconstructed from memory while it was still fresh. The contractor's call. Now the listing. At 1 a.m., I finally texted my mother. Just 4 words. I saw the listing. She didn't respond until morning. When she did, it wasn't an apology. It's not official yet. We're just exploring options. Don't make this a whole thing. Don't make this a whole thing. As if the thing hadn't already been made by her, with a realtor, on my property 3 separate times, without a single conversation with me that wasn't designed to talk me out of my own ownership. My father called me 2 days after that text, which was itself unusual. My father does not call people. My father sends my mother to have conversations and then agrees with whatever she decided. Your mother's very stressed about this, Em, he said, using the childhood nickname like it still worked on me. Dana's due date is coming up fast and Marcus lost some hours at his job. They're genuinely struggling. I understand they're struggling. That doesn't make the house not mine. Nobody's saying it's not yours on paper. We We just think morally, given everything. Dad, did Mom tell you Grandma wasn't thinking clearly when she signed the will? Silence. Long enough that I had my answer before he spoke. She might have said something like that. I don't know the details, Em. I try to stay out of it. You should look into the details because that's not true. And it's the kind of thing that gets said in situations that end up with lawyers in them. Is that a threat? It's a fact. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm telling you what's true so that when this gets ugly, you can't say nobody warned you. He didn't have a response to that. He said he had to go. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after, feeling something shift in my chest. Not less afraid exactly, but less alone with the fear. I'd said the true thing out loud to another person, and it had landed like a fact instead of a tantrum. That mattered more than I expected it to. I told myself one more time that maybe this would fizzle out on its own. Maybe the realtor would lose interest without a signed listing agreement. Maybe my mother would come to her senses. I was done believing that story by the end of the week. I called my grandmother's estate attorney, Diane Marsh, the following Monday. Diane had practiced estate and property law for 26 years in that county, had drafted my grandmother's will personally, and had been the one sitting across the table when Grandma re-signed everything after her stroke, specifically to make it airtight. I told her everything. The dinner, the contractor's call, the listing, the screenshots, my father's call. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated more than I could say at the time. Legally, she said when I finished, you have nothing to worry about. No one can transfer, list, or sell that property without your signature. Full stop. What you're describing, the listing, the walkthrough with the realtor, the misrepresentation to Mr. Ashford about the ownership situation, that's not a threat to your ownership. It's a liability for them. What kind of liability? If your mother represented herself to that realtor as having authority to sell property she doesn't own, and he proceeds to a signed listing agreement or worse, an offer, based on that misrepresentation, that's fraud. Real estate fraud, specifically, misrepresentation of ownership status to a licensed agent. It's the realtor's license on the line as much as your mother's legal exposure. He'll want to know immediately because brokerages do not want to be anywhere near an unauthorized listing. Something in me finally exhaled. I'd been carrying this alone in my head for 3 weeks, turning it into a monster in the dark, and Diane had just handed me the shape of it in daylight, not a monster. A fixable problem, with a name and a procedure attached. So what do? 2 things. First, I draft a formal cease and desist letter to the listing agent and a copy to your parents, establishing clear record that you've asserted ownership and demanded the listing be withdrawn. That protects you if this ever needs to go further. Second, and this is your call, not a legal necessity. You decide what you actually want to do with the house. That second part sat with me for 3 days. Here is the part I haven't told anyone yet, not even Diane, until I'd already made up my mind. I didn't want to keep fighting my family over a house they'd already, in every way that mattered, except the legal one, decided wasn't mine. I loved that house. I loved the creaking floorboard and the stubborn window and the porch my grandfather never finished. But I was 31, I lived 2 hours away, and I was tired, genuinely, bone-deep tired, of a place I loved becoming a battleground every time my family needed something they hadn't earned. So I made a decision that I knew, even as I made it, would detonate something. I decided to sell the house myself, not to Dana, not to my parents, to an actual buyer, at fair market value, on my own timeline, with my own attorney, before anyone else could turn my grandmother's home into a chess piece in a fight I hadn't agreed to play. I didn't tell my mother, I didn't tell Dana, I didn't tell my father. I told Diane and I told Pete because I needed a local set of eyes I trusted, and I told exactly one person besides them, a real estate agent named Renata Ochoa, referred to me by Diane, who had 14 years of experience, and this mattered to me more than almost anything else. Zero connection to Trent Ashford or his brokerage. I want this handled quietly, I told Renata at our first meeting. No sign in the yard, no public listing until we have a serious buyer lined up. I don't want this becoming a spectacle before it's final. That's called a pocket listing, she said. Off market. I can work with a short list of pre-qualified buyers I already have in my network. It'll move slower than a public listing, but it'll move quieter, which sounds like what you actually need. It took 5 weeks. 5 weeks of showings scheduled around Pete's visits, so nothing looked out of place. 5 weeks of my mother texting periodically about next steps for a sale she thought was still hers to orchestrate. 5 weeks of me responding with something non-committal and true. Still thinking about it, Mom? While the actual sale moved forward 2 counties away from anyone who thought they had a say in it. The buyers were a couple named the Halversons, relocating from 3 states away for a job, wanting exactly the kind of quiet 4-acre property with good bones that my grandfather had built with his own hands 50 years earlier. They didn't know anything about my family, they just wanted a house, and I had one to sell, and it was mine to sell. We closed on a Tuesday. Diane handled the closing personally. The wire hit my account at 6:14 a.m. 2 days later, which is when the confirmation email landed on my phone, which is where this story started. Here's what I didn't fully account for. Trent Ashford had, in the intervening weeks, gotten my mother to sign a listing agreement. Not for the sale itself, she couldn't authorize that, and some part of her must have known it, but a marketing agreement, in anticipation of ownership transfer. Whatever legal fiction he'd let himself believe to get a signature and a commission on the horizon. He'd started actively marketing the property to 2 interested parties. He'd told them a deal was close. I didn't know any of this yet. What I knew was that I had 18 days between closing and the moment my mother would inevitably find out, because Pete would would eventually mention the Halversons moving in, or the new mailbox, or literally anything. And there was no version of that county where a piece of information like that stayed contained for long. Diane and I had already discussed this. You have two choices, she'd told me before closing. Tell them proactively, on your terms, with everything already final and undoable. Or let it surface on its own, which it will, and you lose control of how and when they find out. I chose to wait exactly 2 weeks, long enough for the sale to be fully recorded, fully irreversible, completely beyond any possibility of legal challenge. And then I chose to tell them myself on a Sunday at my own kitchen table, on my own terms. I invited my parents and Dana over under the pretense of wanting to talk things through as a family, the same words my mother had used to summon me to that first dinner, deployed now with a very different intention behind them. My hands were steady when I opened the door. That surprised me more than anything else that day. They arrived at 2 p.m. My mother hugged me at the door like nothing had happened in the past 2 months, which I'd come to understand was simply how she operated. Conflict didn't exist once she'd decided it was resolved in her favor. We're so glad you're finally being reasonable about this, she said, settling onto my couch. Trent says the interested buyers are very serious. We could have this wrapped up before the baby comes. Dana, 8 months pregnant now, lowered herself into the armchair with visible relief. Marcus and I already picked paint colors for the nursery. Sage green. I know it's premature, but I couldn't help it. I let her finish. I let the moment sit exactly as long as it needed to. I need to tell you something, I said, and I need you to let me finish before anyone responds. My mother's smile flickered, some old instinct sensing the shift before the words arrived. The house sold 3 weeks ago. I sold it to a family named the Halversons. Closing was finalized and recorded 11 days ago. They move in next month. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. I counted, because counting was the only thing keeping my own voice level. That's not possible, my mother said. Trent has the listing. We have buyers. Trent has a marketing agreement with someone who never owned the property. I have the recorded deed transfer. There's a difference, and it's the same difference there's been this entire time. You can't just, Dana started, her voice climbing. You can't just sell a family house without telling anyone. It wasn't a family house, Dana. It was my house. I told you that in March. I told you that in April. I've been telling you that for 2 months, and nobody believed me enough to stop. My father, who had said almost nothing this entire ordeal, finally spoke. Emily, your sister has a baby coming in 5 weeks. Where exactly did you think this would leave her? Exactly where it left her before any of this started. In her apartment, with a landlord problem that has nothing to do with a house I own free and clear. I'm not responsible for solving a housing problem by giving up something that was never negotiable in the first place. My mother's face had gone through 3 distinct colors in under a minute, flushed with anger, then pale, then a strange mottled red that I recognized distantly as the look she used to get right before she cried at things designed to make other people feel guilty. I can't believe you'd do this to your own sister, she said, and her voice cracked on cue. I didn't do anything to Dana. I sold a house that belonged to me. What I am going to say, because I think you need to hear it plainly. Trent Ashford doesn't know yet that the property he's been marketing hasn't been available for 3 weeks. He's going to find out very soon, because Diane, my attorney, is sending him formal notice tomorrow that the marketing agreement he obtained was based on a material misrepresentation of ownership. That's not me being vindictive. That's just what happens next, legally, whether I want it to or not. You're going to get your own mother in trouble? The question came out sharp, accusatory, like I'd manufactured the consequence instead of simply refusing to shield her from one she'd built herself. I'm not getting you in trouble, Mom. You told a licensed real estate agent you had authority to sell property that wasn't yours. That's the part that's going to be a problem. And it was true 2 months before I ever sold anything. My father stood up. Not angrily, more like a man finally understanding the shape of a hole he was standing in. Ashford's going to want to know why he wasted 6 weeks marketing a property that was never available. That's between you and him. I'd get a lawyer of your own before that conversation, honestly. Dana was crying now, one hand on her belly, and some old reflex in me wanted to soften everything, smooth it over, make it easier for her the way I'd been making things easier for my family my entire life. I didn't. I let her cry, and I sat with the discomfort of not fixing it, because fixing it had never once been reciprocated in the 2 months this had been happening. I need you to leave, I said, as gently as I could manage while still meaning it completely. Not forever, just today. I think everyone needs some time before we talk again, and I think you need to talk to Trent before he calls you. Diane's letter went out Monday morning by certified mail, with a copy emailed directly to Trent Ashford and a second copy to his broker of record, because Diane didn't believe in giving anyone room to claim they hadn't received something. She called me Wednesday afternoon. He called our office within an hour of opening that email, she said. Wanted to know, verbatim, how in God's name he'd walked a property for 6 weeks, generated 2 serious offers, and never once been shown a deed. I told him that was a question for his own broker's compliance procedures, not for me. He didn't love that answer. Is he in real trouble? He's in the kind of trouble where he spends the next several months being very, very careful. Misrepresentation of ownership status is exactly the sort of thing state licensing boards open files on, even when nobody ends up disciplined. He knows that. His broker knows that even better than he does. He called my mother 2 days later. Not me, though she told me about it in a text so clipped and furious it was almost funny. if any of it had still had the power to hurt me by then. Trent Ashford had, according to Diane, withdrawn the marketing agreement immediately upon receiving her letter, terminated the 2 prospective buyer conversations he'd initiated, and, this was the part that seemed to actually frighten my mother, indicated he was consulting his broker about next steps regarding the misrepresentation, which was real estate speak for someone here might be facing a complaint. My mother was not charged with anything. Real estate fraud at that scale, Diane explained, more often results in professional consequences for the agent and a very uncomfortable, very expensive conversation for the person who lied to him, not criminal charges, though the exposure was real, and it stayed real for weeks while everyone waited to see whether Trent's brokerage would escalate it formally. In the end, they didn't. They sent my mother a letter making clear that any future dealings with their firm were off the table, and that was apparently that. Dana had the baby 5 weeks later, a boy, 7 pounds 2 ounces. I sent a gift. I didn't visit the hospital because I hadn't been invited, and I'd finally learned the difference between generosity and obligation. My mother and I didn't speak for 2 months. When we finally did, it was a short, careful phone call that didn't include an apology, exactly, but did include something adjacent to one, an acknowledgement, at least, that she should have talked to me first, which was as close as I suspected I'd ever get. I think about the house sometimes. I drove past it once, 3 months after closing, and saw a swing set half-assembled in the yard where my grandmother's tomatoes used to grow. It didn't feel like loss the way I expected it to. It felt like a photograph of a life that had already ended, viewed from a safe and reasonable distance. Pete still sends me a text every spring when the crocuses come up along the old porch. He doesn't work for the Halversons. No reason to. It's not my property to maintain anymore, but he drives past on his route sometimes, and he thinks of me, he says, and I think that's the nicest thing anyone did for me through this entire mess. A man who owed me nothing, remembering anyway. My grandmother used to say some things only become clear in hindsight, usually the things you were too scared to look at directly while they were happening. I understand now what she meant by airtight. She wasn't just protecting a house. She was protecting the version of me who might one day need proof that what was mine was actually mine. Proof strong enough that I wouldn't have to argue for it, only produce it. I produced it once, quietly, and it was enough.